There's never been an openly like trans MP who's transitioned. Like every rule, every law that I've ever had to live under was written by a cis person. Every head of the NHS, every health secretary has been cis. And it's like, okay.
We wanted a brown home secretary for ages, and look what we got. What's the difference between content creation on a platform like this and performing on the stage of a theatre? What drives the comedy of Dave Chappelle? And what do transphobes have in common with the anti-vax movement? To discuss all this, it's the crossover event that nobody's been asking for. I'm lucky enough to be joined by Abigail Thorn, actress, writer, and creator of Philosophy Tube. I hope you enjoyed the show. So the place where I actually wanted to start today is something that we've got in common, which is both of our media projects really were catalysed by the coalition government trebling tuition fees. So can you just tell me about that? You know, how you got started, what it was like for you in that moment?
Yeah, so I was in the last year to pay the old tuition fees. And I thought it was really unfair that a bunch of my friends weren't going to be able to go to university anymore. And philosophy, which is what I was studying, is already something that's so gated off and difficult to access and has a bit of kind of an elitist vibe about it. So my original plan was just to film my lectures and upload them to YouTube. And my university were like, no, you cannot do this. So I just stood in front of a camera and summarized what I'd learned. And I said, hey, this is what I learned in lectures today. I had to pay for it. You didn't. I'm a muggins, but you get it for free. And that was almost 10 years ago now that Philosophy Tube started. I started filming it in my parents' bedroom. And now, 10 years later, 1.3 or 4 million subscribers at time of recording later, it's become this massive show with characters and jokes and theatre and acting and kind of recurring skits that come back and like incredible costumes and sets and stuff. So it's become this thing in its own right. And funnily enough, I set it up this summer, like one summer at university, and my original plan for that summer was to have an internship at Private Eye, and I got rejected because I thought I wanted to go into journalism and do what you do.
You know what? That was my villain origin story too.
Really?
I got rejected for an internship with the LRB.
So I should have kept that email from me and his lot being just like, sorry, no. There was a moment I felt quite proud, which is when I realised I had a bbigger audience than Private Eye, and I was like,
fuck you.
I was inwardly a little bit proud. So if I ever meet Ian, then I'll have to go thank you.
I mean, so was there something about philosophy in particular which felt politically urgent to share? Or if you'd been studying dentistry, would you have been sharing your, I don't know, introductory lecture on the molar?
No, I would have done it with dentistry too. Philosophy was just what I was sharing at the time. In those days, there wasn't anybody else talking about it. I mean, now you can throw a stone on YouTube and you'll hit sort of 10 people who are talking about ideas. But back then, there was PBS Idea Channel, and that was about it. So I just decided to give away what I was doing. I loved philosophy, and I was especially inspired by my philosophy teacher. So I thought, well, why not share that?
Has there been anything through sharing your knowledge of philosophy on YouTube that made you then go back and question what you were learning within the academy? Because one of the things that happens all the time with Novara is that, you know, we're talking about economics, for instance, and someone will say something, I'll be like, hang on, everything that I learned within this very establishment institution was wrong.
The curriculum that I was taught at university was excellent, but it was very white, cis and male. And so after a few years of doing Philosophy Tube, I started to realise that a little bit. And I didn't like the idea that somewhere there might be like a 17-year-old girl of colour watching my show thinking, well, this is great, but I can't do that. And I want to be like, okay, I want everybody to be able to look at this and think, I could have a great idea. I could understand philosophy. Like, why shouldn't a 17-year-old girl of colour have an opinion about Schopenhauer? Or like, why shouldn't a Midwestern mum have an opinion about Shakespeare or you know, the great art of the day or the great theatre of the day or the great political discussions of the day? I think that the cultural and intellectual history of humanity is a common resource. And I thought it's not, if you gate that off and you make people pay for it, you kind of fundamentally misunderstood what it is. Like that belongs to all of us. So I made a conscious effort after a few years of Philosophy Tube to say, okay, I want to firstly get like more women philosophers cited on the show and like more philosophers of color and then like more trans philosophers and queer philosophers and bring in all these different perspectives. And yeah, it was a conscious effort to evolve it and make it more inclusive.
I think you raise a really interesting point about philosophy being for everyone. And that's certainly how I felt about studying literature. And similarly, it was, dead white guy bonanza, particularly in our first year when you learn the canon, right? And it starts with the Odyssey. Well, it starts with the Iliad and then the Odyssey, and then you move through the novel, blah, 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 blah. And in the entirety of the canon, you had two women. One was George Eliot and one was Toni Morrison. So we finally got a person of colour right at the end.
Yeah.
And then
just as a treat.
They were like, bet you want to read about some slavery now?
Yeah. Oh God, oh no.
I mean, and obviously Beloved is a masterpiece, but it's also quite gross that this is the only time you acknowledge the existence of writers of colour. And that didn't last very long, because then by year 3, they decided to scrap Toni Morrison and replace her with Katzea, Disgrace. So the novel, which is like, apartheid ended and I feel kind of fucked up about it.
Yeah. Well, that kind of thing still happens today. Like, I know writers and actors of colour and like producers of colour who are in the acting world just like, oh, you can tell a story about racism, but you're not allowed to do anything else. And it's like, oh yeah, it's still happening.
I mean, I think it's also a challenge in terms of how we think about representation, which is, okay, well, we're just going to, stuff the canon with stuff which has been produced by people of colour. And I think that's one form of representation. But it's also, I want to be represented in the critique of it and in the engagement of it. Like, there is a dialogue between people of colour and Shakespeare. And you can tell that because of how many times Shakespeare's been staged across the global south and the different sort of settings that have been incorporated into stagings of Shakespeare. And so I don't just want it to be like, okay, well, you guys get the authors of colour and you can talk about that, but Shakespeare is for us.
Yeah. I mean, I struggle a little bit with the idea of representation, because yes, it's nice to have somebody who like looks like you in the thing, but often the roles are quite limited, and also I'm aware that representation doesn't always affect material conditions. So that's definitely something that I sort of struggle with and go back and forth on, and that I live the question when it comes to my own media work.
I mean, I want to talk about this sort of, real pivot into representation that you've taken, which is theatre and acting. Did that feel like it had organically grown out of your work with Philosophy Tube, or was it you going, oh fuck, I need to do something different, fuck this, like I want the stage?
No, I've been acting since I was 3.
What?
Yeah, I've been acting my whole life.
What was your first role as a 3-year-old?
I think I played part of the night sky in the nativity play. I was one of the stars.
I was the narrator.
Yeah.
And oh my God, I've never gotten over it, because for the nativity and then also the Christmas play the next year, they had the same blonde girl with curly hair. She got to play Mary and then she got to play Mrs. Christmas. And that unprofessional bitch, she cried on stage both times. And I was like...
But yeah, so I've been acting since I was little, and I always wanted to do acting. My parents said, well, why don't you go to university first, and then if acting doesn't work out, you've at least got a degree. And YouTube was kind of a hobby that just happened to blow up before acting did. And now I'm starting to realize that I can actually put these two things together. So I went to, I think in year 4 or 5 of Philosophy Tube, I went to professional drama school in London and like kept making the show while I was going through my drama school training. And it just so happened that YouTube got big first. But acting has always been where my heart is.
I mean, do these two things have a relationship to each other? I mean, obviously Philosophy Tube has a lot of drama kind of encoded within it. But is there a tension between being a content creator and someone who's really recognizable for the character you've created to tell this story, and then also having to like disappear into a role and subordinate your persona in some way to this other character?
I mean, I used to think there was, and I used to think, oh, I'm going to have to let Philosophy Tube go if acting really takes off. But then we did my play and we kind of combined the two, and it was a big hit.
The play itself, for our audience who aren't familiar with it, it's called The Prince.
Yeah.
It's kind of playing around with Henry IV Part 1.
Yeah, it's about a bunch of characters in a Shakespeare play who start to realise they're stuck in a play and break out of it, and they kind of crash through the Shakespeare multiverse as they're doing this.
So one of the things that I thought when I was reading about it is that you do have these like postmodernist versions of Shakespeare. So really famously, you had it with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is taking these two very peripheral characters from Hamlet and going, right, let's go to town.
I
with
love
you
that.
guys.
I've been in it twice. I was like very inspired.
I've been both Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. But they don't do it with history plays, right? So what was it about Henry IV Part 1, which was a big old hit in its day because everybody loved Falstaff, but maybe, you know, outside of the Academy isn't, you know, it's not a real, you know, thigh slapper of a play anymore. What attracted you to that one?
It's just Hotspur. Hotspur is a character. So in The Prince, Hotspur is the villain. And I played Hotspur, and over the course of the play, she comes to realize that she needs to escape the Shakespeare multiverse. And what drew, I loved her as a character. I thought she was wonderful. She is, I mean, like, spoilers, there's a big kind of like gender theme to it. It's not just about that, but kind of the roles that we play for other people is the theme. And in Henry IV Part 1, Hotspur is from the north, from Northumberland, like I am. She is the child of a family that has like a lot of expectations on her. She is somebody who in the original text is constantly praised for being like a macho, tough guy, because in the original text she's a man. I just thought this is just really fun. It's a really fun character to play with. She just had big egg vibes. I was just like, Hotspur, she seems like a closeted trans woman. She seems like she's trying too hard. And I was like, okay, I understand that as a feeling. And also because I thought there was a nice parallel between that and the way that people often approach Shakespeare with expectations that it should be weighty and it should be like there's a way that you have to do it right, and it's like, oh, very important to the nation, and oh yes, we all love it very much, very serious.
Winston Churchill plays Hamlet.
Yeah, exactly. It has that kind of gravitas to it, and I was like, that's also like what people feel about masculinity. It's like, oh, you have to do it, you have to be very good at it, you have to be very strong, and you have to be very tough, and everyone has to take it seriously, and you must never have fun, ever. And I was like, oh, that's kind of what, for me, being in the closet was like. So I was like, oh, there's a kind of nice parallel here, and I thought, yeah, Hotspur's a really fun character to mess around with this.
And it's also really quite jokes that people think about Shakespeare as being super serious and blah, 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 about the nation, whereas his favourite thing in his plays was to make the gender bending of the stage part of the plot. He was like, okay, I'm not going to let you forget that these are boys dressed up as girls as romantic leads. We're going to have whole plays about that just to like fuck with you a bit. And also, Shakespeare was kind of a hoe. Like, you know, he wasn't somebody who was like, nah, I'm just in my garret and I'm going to be the best playwright in Britain.
Very, very serious. Like, he was bi, probably. Like, that's queer literature. So people were like, oh, do you feel strange like queering Shakespeare? I was like, I'm not queering Shakespeare. He's already queer. Like,
yeah, he done queered himself.
Yeah. Like, he was queered by God. Like, that's how it works. But yeah, I really had fun with it. I was kind of dreading it because as we were building up to opening night, I, Joan was on at the Globe. I, Joan was a retelling of the history of Joan of Arc, with Joan played by a trans actor, and Joan was non-binary in the play. And there was a kind of big stink about this. There was a lot of like newspaper articles about like this disgraceful and like rewriting history. And I was like, I'm rewriting Britain's national poet and making several of her central characters secretly trans women.
It's like theatre being modernised to tell us a story about our contemporary society.
What? Transgender people on stage? No. And like all three leads of my play were trans women, because I think British acting and theatre in particular has a bit of a bug up its ass at the moment about trans women being allowed on stage. And even when the characters are trans women, they are sometimes played by people who are not, because I think there's kind of a bit of a fear of us and of our bodies. And so I was like, okay, right, top three characters on the character list, all three trans women, both heroes and the villain, gotta have us on the stage, nothing about us without us. So that was fun. And I was like, oh God, I'm kind of dreading this. And there was, unfortunately, some transphobic backlash in the press against me specifically, which was hurtful. I was like, oh, my parents read this newspaper and here it is saying horrible things about me. So that was hurtful.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about this with regards to this horrible backlash which is being meted out to Dylan Mulvaney. And it doesn't matter what I read about that backlash. The objection is just, she's trans and I don't like it.
Yeah.
Which to me is just like, regardless of if you like her, if you don't like her, if she makes you want to buy Nike products or not, that's not a good objection.
Yeah. I mean, like, my heart, just because I'm in the same space, in the same world, my heart is just, I don't know Dylan personally, but my heart just goes out to her, and I'm like, I hope that she's okay, because I know the pressures that she must be under, although I know them to a lesser extent than she does. By the way, I don't know if we said this in the intro, but hi, I'm trans. That's why we're talking about this now. If you didn't already know, that's why we got onto this.
Well, don't worry. Like in the intro that I do at the top of the show, I'm not going to be like, I'm here with professional transgender Abigail Thorn, who has no other personality traits.
Oh God, yeah. There's a lot of pressure to do that,
She's trans full time, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. You have to be, otherwise you can't get fucking healthcare in this country. Anyway, yeah. So my heart.
I mean, is there a part of you when you're thinking about being trans, being a content creator, being hypervisible, and then being on the stage, coming back to this question of being allowed to disappear into a role, do you think that all of these things mean that you have to approach the craft differently to how a cisgender actress might be able to do it?
I mean, there's some interesting hiccups sometimes, not hiccups, but some interesting features that are unique to trans acting. So Hotspur spends most of the prince in the closet. So people refer to her as like he and male, and she's constantly being praised for her masculinity. And she has to be in quite a kind of macho, aggro space. And that was difficult. There were some nights I was like, this really feels like climbing into a coffin. Especially standing on the stage next to Joni and Mary, who are both like gorgeous trans women, and this is the only character in the play who plays against her real gender. So that was challenging. But at the same time, there's like some bits that are fun about it. So I have 2 vocal ranges. I won't demonstrate it now because it's terrifying. But I have like a full female range and a full male range in my voice. So that's quite good for voiceover. And that opens opportunities. But no, I mean, when I act, it's like, when I act, I get to use all of me. When I'm making content or Philosophy Tube, I get to use the brain and I get to use the sparkle. But when I act, it's like body, mind, brain, research, spirit, whatever that is, like physicality, sensuality. It's a complete dissolving, a complete focus. It's just the most beautiful, wonderful thing.
So I was talking about this with my partner the other week, because one of my bugbears about Hollywood, particularly compared to British acting, is that I think people are too good looking. Like they're like implausibly good looking and everyone's got perfect teeth. And it seems to me that there is this way in which acting becomes an extension of modelling. Mm-hmm. And it feels that as a nation that Britain is better able to produce actors who have a lot more experience from the theatre, number one, but also don't have to be classically, conventionally good looking. And I just sort of wondered what you made of that. Like, is this just a stupid opinion where, you know, I've turned 30 and suddenly I've got these reactionary opinions like, that person's too good looking, fuck their teeth up a bit. Or is there something in this desire on my part to see like 50 Olivia Colmans, all right? She's not going to be the face of a perfume brand, and that's not her fucking job, because she's going to clean up at the Oscars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I've just noticed as a woman, is that certainly in feature films, male actors are allowed to be like, you can be older, you can be younger, you can be like bigger, you can be smaller. Especially in terms of age, there's a lot of range. Mm. But for female actors, if you want to play a character who like has an arc, who like gets to do things in the story, there's still like a very limited number of body types that you can have. And you still have to be, in a lot of feature films, sexy in the specific way that appeals to certain cis men, which is sometimes a bit like, because, you know, I'm happy with the way that I look. I think I'm reasonably good looking. I'm certainly not like, you know.
I would consider myself moderately attractive.
I do okay on the apps. Like, I do fine. But I'm not sexy in the specific way that Hollywood quite likes, which is to say, you know, 5'5" model. Which, you know, nothing against women who fit that casting.
They're not, you know what, they're not an oppressed minority, right? You've rolled the dice of life and you've won Anya Taylor-Joy. Like, it's fine. But there is a whole range of women who don't get to be seen.
Yeah, most of the time, yes, that's very true.
Just moving away from acting a little bit and getting into philosophy, politics, and YouTube. How would you describe your political philosophy?
I wouldn't.
What do you mean you wouldn't?
I wouldn't describe it publicly.
Well, but that's not the same as how you vote.
Well, so Philosophy Tube is about compassion and reason, and it's always about seeing all sides, which sometimes means that I don't say things that arguably should be said. It's a limitation of the show, but I made like a promise to myself many years ago when I started. First of all, I would never say anything bad about anyone publicly using my platform. I would never single anyone out like that, and also that I would be quite guarded about that stuff. So I try always on Philosophy Tube to be even-handed. I think I often fail, but I know that people appreciate the effort, and I hope that I fail in interesting ways. So I do try to keep my politics fairly, not entirely covered, because I think it is quite obvious if you watch the show, but I do try and stay not neutral, but I guess even-handed, because that's kind of necessary for being a public educator. You know, it's my dad is a doctor. Both my parents are doctors, and my dad used to say that it was quite important that, like, if somebody walks into a doctor's office and the doctor's like wearing a Tory rosette or like a Labour rosette or whatever, then the person who walks in is going to form some judgments about the doctor and may not tell them certain things. And what you don't tell your doctor might be the thing that kills you. And so that idea had quite a big impression on me. And so I try to make Philosophy Tube, and to a certain extent my public brand, one that anyone can engage with, as long as you're not like transphobic or bigoted, right?
I mean, I totally get that from a relationship with a doctor or a relationship with a counsellor or a therapist or a teacher in a classroom even, where they have a duty of care, right? And they have responsibilities towards me, which mean that they kind of have to disappear a bit, because if you're a teacher in a classroom, you have safeguarding duties. If you're a counsellor, you have a responsibility for my mental health. If you're my GP, I have to tell you about that weird ooze, and that requires a certain level of trust. But I guess the thing I'm maybe hinting at when it comes to forms of political education or politicised education is that it's not necessarily about you going and you have to be this way because that's how I am, but it's a cards on the table, and it says, okay, this is where I'm coming from. I'm handling arguments and facts as objectively as I can, but this is where I'm coming from. And so what do you make of that as a counter argument to the need for...
Yeah, that's definitely something that it's a question that I try to live on Philosophy Tube. And it's kind of a tightrope act. It's one that I don't think I always nail, but I do try very hard to do that, because I think that content creators have a responsibility to our audiences. Certainly at the kind of like level I'm at now, I'm very aware of the responsibility that I have to my audience, because if I say something, I know that across the country, across many countries, students in class are going to raise their hand and they're going to repeat what I say. So I do try to be quite careful about that.
Moving on just a little bit. So I was watching your Islamophobia video, and you talked about reading the New Atheists when you're in your teens, and then kind of having to revisit some of that material and identify and critique some of the Islamophobic tropes within it. So could you tell me a bit about that? Because I remember reading The God Delusion when I was like 17 and being like, oh my God, this is so smart. And then revisiting it when I was 21 and being like, ooh.
I do remember reading the New Atheist stuff. I went through New Atheist phase as a lot of people did back then. And
what did you read, and how did you respond to it?
I was big into Christopher Hitchens. I used to stay up drinking whiskey, watching Christopher Hitchens, thinking I was so cool.
The New Atheist thing felt, I mean, well, not just felt, like it was incredibly white and male, and also had this kind of affect of going, you're stupid and you're wrong and we're rational. And when I was a teenager, that was really appealing, because obviously I wanted to be the smarty pants in the room and everyone else is a big dum-dum.
Of course.
But then you start going, how is this a way to take us as a society to a more enlightened place? You guys who all really had a big old hard-on for bombing Iraq, retaining your certainty in your own correctness in all things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost too early to tell what the full impact of that phase of public intellectual life will be. I've yet to see anyone kind of look back and really sort of sum it up in a perfect way. Because I think it's almost a little bit too early to say what the impact of that was. We do still have a state religion in this country, and we do, bishops still do have seats in the House of Lords. and it's still like, oh, that is still a thing. And like we're talking about, for instance, having religious carve-outs for conversion therapy when the majority of conversion therapy is that. So that would kind of carve out for most of it. So I think, like, the whole Scottish leader thing with Kate Forbes. We still had a big discourse about challenging people on the basis of their faith, and it's like, oh, no, challenging people for their homophobia, So yeah, I think I'm yet to really come to a place where I'm like, oh yeah, that's what this was about completely.
I mean, with the Kate Forbes thing, I mean, there was this defense of, well, this is religious belief and therefore it's private. But she's running for high office. She's being a minister. And so I think that everyone can at least agree that that scrutiny is legitimate. She doesn't get to wall it off. But what about, churches, which are still deeply homophobic or are lobbying for exemptions to conversion therapy? How do you balance the need for protection of human rights in all contexts and also the freedom to practice religion? Because I think about this a lot, obviously, with Islam. There's a lot of fucked up stuff that goes on in the name of Islam. There's a lot of fucked up stuff that goes on in certain mosques, right, in terms of how women are treated or how gay people are talked about. And particularly as a Muslim, I'm also really aware of how liberal human rights discourse has been used as the pointy end of a spear to restrict Muslims of their human rights.
Mm-hmm. And there's often this, I'm particularly aware of this with regards to trans and queer stuff, there's often a tendency to go, oh, we'll solve this with like more policing and more hate crime laws. And it's like, well, think about things like healthcare, things like housing, is this really the solution that is going to be the most effective for the stated aims here? Certainly there's like an angle for critique there. Yeah.
Do you think there's a role for like public ethicists who are, not just intervening in, the hot button topic of the day, but are also participating in institutions? Or do you sort of think that that is just a bit of like, a bit of a morally respectable veneer for bad behaviour? Like when banks say, okay, we're going to invite an ethicist in to talk to us, or,
I've done that. I was invited to be the ethics consultant at a banking conference a while ago. I don't think I did a particularly good job at that conference. I guess I find it, I'm often very reluctant to sort of sit on high and say this is how society should be, because I don't see that as being my role. I'm an actor and I'm somebody who like tells people about things that I learned at university. I'm not somebody who I don't want to sit on high and say this is how I think you must all behave. Because I'm very aware of the influence that I have, and I don't want to misuse that. So I'm a little bit kind of kid gloves, and I do sort of take both sides and try to. I did a video recently with a couple of friends where we talked about somebody who had been intensely transphobic, and even then I found myself going, well, I guess from the other side you go, and then I was like, why am I doing this? Like, this person literally does not want me to have equal rights, and yet here I am still being reflexively compassionate.
See, this is the bit where I'm like, is that I think that being reflexively compassionate and self-critical is a value that you're advancing. You're going, I think this is really important in public life. And I think that that's, a positive and an active statement. It's not actually just a retreat from something. So I suppose the bit that I'm a bit confused by is when there are all these ways in which you're actively advancing a view of how things should be. You think that education should be available to everyone. You think that people should have access to all of the materials they need to make sense of the world. And then you go, but I'm not going to talk about how society should be. Well, you already are.
Yeah. You got me there. There is a kind of like, there is a harsh way of describing it would be hypocrisy, but perhaps a more interesting way would be tension or question. At the
heart, the way in essays you talk about it's like there's a tension here.
Yeah, at the heart of Philosophy Tube as a project, right, which is trying to educate people, but like not trying to tell them what to think. Again, I think I often fail on Philosophy Tube to be as compassionate or as even-handed as I could be, and my only hope is that I fail in interesting ways.
It's the Samuel Beckett thing, fail better.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the compassion towards someone, or at least the attempt to understand someone who had been intensely transphobic. How is it for you doing the job that you do with Philosophy Tube? Also, being a really high profile trans person in the context of this horrible, horrible moral panic, is there a part of you which goes, I want to understand transphobia and I want to understand these arguments? Or do you go, well, I don't want to. I want to just insulate myself from it and protect my well-being?
No, there's definitely a part of me that wants to understand, because I like to learn. And when somebody says something, I like to go, oh, okay, like, what have you said here? Like, let me just sort of like, I really enjoy doing that. And I feel like I do have a pretty reasonable understanding of like what transphobia is and where it comes from. I can, talk at length about sort of theories of like how it works epistemologically. But yeah, there is a part of me that wants to understand it. I guess I do derive some comfort from understanding things. I'm like, okay, I know why this person believes and thinks this. Like, they're wrong. And unfortunately, they have power, so there's not much I can do about it. But I do derive some comfort from understanding.
Do people ever let you in? Because that's the frustration that I get, which is there have been several times where I'm getting racial abuse from somebody and it can be really violent. And I'm so curious about who they are. I just want to know, like, what is your life like? What kind of room are you sitting in when you're saying these things? Mm-hmm. Why do you think this? And what is driving you towards saying this, like, violent or racist thing to me? But they never let me in. They never give me the understanding of what's going on for them. And that's the thing which I find more frustrating than the racism. It's the refusal to satisfy my curiosity in some way.
Yeah, I suppose I don't get curious about the person per se. So when like mum suffragette 6970243 underscore XX is, calling me a man on Twitter, I'm like, Susan, tell me about your life. Like, what's your relationship with your kids like?
Oh, see, I'm so nosy because my mum's a social worker, right? So I'm like, tell me about your fucked up relationship with your parents. I'm here.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a part of me that, like, as an actor, is definitely interested in the person, because getting inside other people's heads is kind of my job. But I'm more with the intellectual curiosity. I'm like, okay, what's the argument that you're making here? How can I fit this into like a generalized theory? So I have this theory that transphobia is a kind of organized, deliberate ignorance. I think that people often talk about like, oh, people are just ignorant. They feel what they don't understand. And I'm like, okay, yes, but some people also refuse to understand. And I think transphobia can be understood as an organized, deliberate ignorance. And I think that it's a refusal to look at the facts of biology, like about other people like, oh, there's like only two sexes, XX and XY. And every scientist and biologist in the world would be like, no, it's not. No, it's not. Absolutely, it's more complex than that. Sex is a cluster of properties. You can absolutely change them, or like change a lot of them. I myself have changed sex. Like, believe me, you can do it. But then people will go, no, you just can't do that. I refuse to look at these facts. That's not true. What I was told in high school is the case. And then you'll have people who go, oh, like self-ID is a threat to women. It's like, okay, well, here are the stats from like the dozens of countries that have already adopted self-ID. There's no proven threat to women at all. There's no evidence for this position at all. People go, no, refuse to look at that, won't do it. Something that I often see transphobic people do on social media is you'll like try and explain what sex is to them, or you try and say, oh, here's the stats, whatever, and they'll just say word salad. And that's their reply. It's just like, I refuse to understand this. I won't look at it. And it's like, you can't really argue with people whose whole position is the denial of reality. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift now, because so a while ago people said, oh, trans women are raising lesbians. And then the census came out and showed there's more lesbians in Britain than ever before. So this is like clearly proven.
The girls
false.
are thriving.
Yeah, we're doing great, right? But now there's been a bit of a shift because, oh, lesbians are being pushed to the back of the queue, which is a kind of non-empirical claim. It's like, you can't really prove or disprove that. It's a vibe.
So a queue for what?
Exactly, right? It's a metaphor for, we don't know. But it's a kind of like non-empirical claim. So they've started to realize that they've just kind of lost the argument on the facts, right? And people used to say, and people still do say, oh, self-ID would be a threat to women. And then everyone goes, well, actually, stats prove that that isn't true. If anything, not having it is a threat to some women, mainly trans women, right? But also like enforcing kind of what biological sex, or the kind of very warped, limited version of that the gender critical movement has, would actually be more of a threat to women, because you're going to have to do like genital checks at the door of like toilets and shit. So now there's been a bit of a shift where people go, oh, you're asking women to go against our instincts. I think Rosie Duffer was saying this today. And it's like, well, that's, again, much more of a vibes-based argument, because you're kind of going, well, I accept that I'm wrong and that my position has no evidence. And the unstated assumption is that we should listen to that because she's cis. So there's this prioritizing of cis vibes and cis feelings over what can be proven and like what can be established. And I think that's part of a wider project of denying trans people's ability to contribute to human intellectual and artistic understanding.
But do you think that there is a way in which liberal identity politics, representation politics has contributed to this, in that one of the things which has become this kind of slogan is listen to this person from X marginalized community. They are an authority and they are right. And you end up deferring your own critical faculties to this person who comes cloaked in legitimacy because of some aspect of their marginalized identity. And then that person can use that marginalized identity to say all kinds of fucked up shit, right? So you end up with an example from a totally different, area of politics. You end up with this absurd argument by David Baddiel, where in his book he argues that an Arab Muslim man looking at a picture of Jesus and going, damn, he looks like family. Well, that's a form of anti-Semitism because you didn't say Jesus looks Jewish, right? And the argument that David Baddiel makes is, well, I'm authoritative on this. I'm authoritative on anti-Semitism. You have to accept this argument, even though it's, totally batshit. Another one might be is if I, as a Muslim, were to say, okay, there is this very well documented social phenomena of Islamophobia. So that means anytime I interact with a Jewish person or a Christian person, right, that fear of Islamophobia means it's legitimate for me to hate and fear this person. And I think you have this argument being used by the likes of Rosie Duffield by going, we have this very real social phenomena of misogyny and violence against women. Mm-hmm. And I am afraid of that violence. That is a reasonable fear to have. Mm-hmm. But then it means that any time I feel afraid, or any time I say I feel afraid, that comes with this authority. And it means you have to believe me, right? It's an extension of the believe women argument. And I guess the thing I'm asking you is, do you think that some of the sloganeering from liberal identity politics, believe women, listen to X person from marginalized community, it then means you can't cut through the bullshit and say to a marginalized person, you're wrong?
I definitely think that it is possible for people to weaponize media strategies. And I think that would be the same, like whatever the media strategy was. I don't think there would be like a bulletproof way of advancing politics that like couldn't be twisted by someone else. I'll also say that I haven't read David Baddiel's book, so I can't really comment on that.
I'm not inviting you to comment on the book,
Cool,
don't worry.
thank you.
I'm commenting on the book. I'm talking shit about people on camera.
I simply never do this. I think it can definitely be weaponized. I mean, there are trans people who've argued against trans rights, not just in the media, but like in politics. There's trans people who've like testified in front of state bodies to say that we shouldn't be included in hate crime legislation or given rights and so on. Absolutely. You can weaponize that sort of thing.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you, particularly because of your background in philosophy, is that it seems to me that there are two different strategies being taken up by trans people in navigating this media politics minefield. Because one of the questions that you get asked all the time, and it is a loaded question, and it comes loaded with all of this transphobic content, is, well, what is a woman, right? And if you give an answer which isn't inclusive of trans women, well, then you've won the game of what is a woman. And if you give an answer which is inclusive of trans women, you've lost the game of what is a woman. And you've got two different strategies for responding to it. One, as far as I can understand it, is what Sean Fay says, which is, I'm not going to get drawn into the metaphysics of gender, all right? We don't have to fucking agree on what the relationship is between body and self, right? We don't have to agree on the relationship between sex and gender, biology and identity, blah, 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 blah. I'm not getting drawn into it. We just have to stick to, the material core demands for human rights. Mm-hmm. And then there is another school of thought, which is saying, actually, no, we do kind of have to engage with this in some way. And you do have people who are discussing, well, does gender really exist? How real is this? Is this something which is innate and within me, or is this something which is conditioned by society? Where do you stand first strategically on that question of how do you respond to that question? And then secondly, how do you personally make sense of it?
My response to being asked that question publicly would always be to like defer with a joke, which is something. It's like a technique that
Yeah, you can't do that with me.
technique I've like perfected. So if people ask me like, "What is a woman?" I go, "I define it thus," which is like it's also a philosophical joke, like an ostensible
Bishop Buckley,
definition.
right? The refute it thus. The
Yeah, I
rock.
refute it thus. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I would do that. It's the same way when people ask me. I get asked this question a lot by cis interviewers. People say, "So when did you know?" And that's really a kind of like a trap question, because it's like, well, if I give an answer that's like yesterday, then they'll go, oh, well, that's too recently, you can't possibly know. And if I go, oh, from childhood, they'll go, oh, well, you were a child, you were too young to know, you can't really know. So there's no correct answer to that. So when people say, when did you know? I say, well, it's kind of like asking, when did the financial crash happen? Yes, there was a date at which it became obvious, but really there was a buildup of a lot of things, and like it was an unsustainable system, and like experts long predicted that this would happen eventually. So I always give a kind of like joke answer to it. So how would I deal with it strategically? I try not to. I do it again. I don't see that as my place. Like I'm just an actor. I'm just Blorbo from your shows.
Well, true, but you also have, done a really long and well scripted and thoroughly researched video about the philosophy of identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did.
So I don't buy this like, oh, I'm just a little small bean actress, because you have intervened on this.
Yes, I suppose I have. I guess strategically, I see what Sean is doing about that focus on human rights and stuff. I think to a certain extent, this question of like, well, how do you define it is a little bit loaded, because cis people aren't asked to define what being cis means before they get rights. So I'm just like, well, okay, we can have this discussion if you want, but it seems like there's some core material demands that might need to be met first. That at the end of the day, like, people should be free to pursue their own vision of what a good life is. Is that not the promise of a liberal state? Which, yes, we can critique the promises of liberalism all day long, but that's what's written on the page. So I'm like, well, liberals got to kind of hold you to this. So yeah, that's something that I generally sort of don't like to be drawn into, about like what is strategically the best way to do it. I know that there's a big drive at the moment for trans representation, and something I've said when I've spoken at Pride a couple of times is like, yes, that's nice, but like trans power is also the goal. Like trans people being able to control their own lives. Like there's never been an openly like trans MP who's transitioned. Like every rule, every law that I've ever had to live under was written by a cis person. Every head of the NHS, every health secretary has been cis, and it's like, okay.
Say that we wanted a brown home secretary for ages, and look what we got.
Yes, yeah, perhaps, yes.
I was gonna be like,
yeah, okay, maybe that's yeah. But yes, trans power is I think the goal strategically. I don't think I'm a political strategist, so I can't really comment on like what the best way everyone. So that there's like the things that I do, but I don't want to say this is how it should always be done, because like diversity of tactics.
All right, so then if we talk about it in terms of personal strategies, personal tactics, do you find the question of what is a woman at all interesting? Or for you, is it so loaded by the transphobic context in which it emerges that you go, there's no value in me dignifying it with an answer or thought?
I don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about it, to be honest. It seems to me that a lot of cis people are a bit insecure in their genders.
God, me too.
Do you know what I mean?
God, me too.
Well, I'm not. Like, I'm kind of found mine. It's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. I think a lot of cis people like worry a lot about their gender, and in particular, like they see someone like me and they're like, oh, what does this say about my gender? That this person, or like maybe I want to do that, or like maybe I'm attracted to this person. What does that say about me? And I'm just like, oh, it seems like cis people are having a bit of an identity crisis here. Can't relate. So yeah.
I mean, I was discussing this with Amir Srinivasan, who wrote The Right to Sex, which is a phenomenal book, and everyone should read it if they get their little mitts on it. And we're having this discussion about what is the like motivating animus behind trans hostile feminists, particularly the ones who dominate the commentariat and the media, because it is something which I always found really difficult to understand. I found it really difficult to understand, why are you so angry and upset? There are lots of things which make me feel angry and lots of things which make me feel upset. But someone else having rights so they can lead a more dignified life isn't one of them. And one of the things that Amia said is that many of these women, they say, well, you know, if transgender ideology had been around when I was growing up, you know, I would have been forced to be, you know, trans. I'd have forced to, you know, become a trans man. And one of the things that Amir says is that reveals is this sense of going, hang on, here we are living within this society which is like very fucked up by gender, and cis people experience how fucked it is to live under the regime of gender. The way in which homophobia polices and disciplines cisgender straight men, for instance, is one way in which it's this fucked up regime. If you're a cisgender woman and your first experiences of, you know, sexual harassment by much older men are still when you're in primary school, you go, this is really fucked up. I'm living under this horrible regime of gender, and it curtails my experience of my own humanity in all these ways. And then along come trans people, and you go, wait, you're happy? What the fuck? Do you think that there is this sense of some transphobia being motivated by how dare you be happy?
I think that's a little bit of it. So I guess if we talked earlier on about transphobia as a form of deliberate ignorance, it's like, okay, what motivates you? What do you get out of remaining deliberately ignorant? I think some of it is honestly a little bit of old-fashioned disgust. I think some people think the idea of a trans person or the image of a trans person, they're like, ugh. That's their reaction. I think trans people are beautiful. I think there's something wonderful and joyous about seeing someone live free. Because, like, I'm a human being too. When I see another human being live free, it makes me feel good. Some people find that disgusting for whatever reason. I think some of it is a little bit of what you described, which I think I might even dare to use the word jealousy. I never forget a moment that I was having laser in the first year of my transition, and my laser tech was this beautiful blonde Eastern European woman, like
a gazelle.
Yeah, she was like gorgeous woman. And we finished the laser session, and she said, "Oh, I'm so jealous of you." And I was like, "What? You look like that. You've just spent 20 minutes firing lasers at my asshole, and you're telling me that you're jealous of me? Like, what do you mean?" And she said, "Because you are so tall." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I think there is maybe a little bit of like, how dare you be happy? I mean, yeah, I guess I'm like 6'1". I know exactly what I want out of life. I can log on to dating apps and do fairly well with men with whom I'm not interested, but I can if I want to.
She said, flexing on the 5'2" Bengali. Thanks.
But yeah, I think there is maybe an element of that. Kind of like, how dare you be happy? I think also that trans people, we reveal a great truth by simply existing, which is that if you want to change sex, you can. It is possible to do that. Which it kind of follows from that sexual hierarchy is a bit like, well, that's a made-up human construct. And like, if we wanted to change that about society, if we wanted to get rid of the regime of gender, as you said it, we could. I think that's a kind of vindication of feminism. Like, as a feminist and as a woman, I find that to be a wonderful thing. But I suppose if you've gotten something out of the regime of gender, or you are afraid of it, then I suppose that might come as something scary. I think for a lot of people, I think certainly about my parents' generation, they grew up with an image of trans people as being unfortunate or dangerous. And so I think probably there's a fair amount of worry about being left behind, or worry about being sneered at or looked down on.
I mean, it's really interesting to hear you talk about that, because I was thinking about this when I was watching the Dave Chappelle Netflix specials. And for me, Dave Chappelle is like Richard Pryor. He's this once-in-a-generation comedic talent. And so when you see those powers being used for the purposes of cruelty, there is something which I find so deeply sad about it. And, you know, there's all sorts of really crazy expectations we have of stand-up comics, that they now have this kind of, you know, role of the leader at a political rally now. It's like we have these really weird expectations of them. But in terms of the way in which they use comedy to tell a story of where society's at, I kind of think there is this immense power in stand-up when it's done well. And I was watching these Netflix specials where Dave Chappelle again and again kind of returns to the trans community to give them a kicking, right? And I was like, where is this coming from? Like, where is this coming from? From one of the most insightful social commentators, I think, in American popular culture. Where is this coming from? And the thing that he says again and again in various different ways is trans people have skipped the queue in terms of oppression. And here I am, a black man, we're still being killed. All these things are happening. And along come trans people. Now, how that's framed is a fiction. There are black trans people. I don't think trans people are having a great time.
Yeah,
right?
Trans people of colour in particular.
You know, thinking about how trans people are being targeted by legislation, whatever queue you've jumped, I'm not sure I want to be in front of you, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, you know, but there was this feeling of scarce resources which have been wrongfully taken up by trans people. And I was like, well, that's one way of looking at it. The way in which I see it is that I see all of these parallels between racism and transphobia. I don't think they're exactly the same thing, but I see all these parallels. And particularly when it comes to media strategies, I'm like, you did that to us. I recognize that straight away. And I suppose turning this from a set of disparate observations into a question, do you see hope for coalition building across different kinds of communities who've experienced forms of oppression, marginalization, dispossession? Or are you seeing the kind of scarce resources logic dominate and win out?
I hope that there is possibility for coalition. I think the trans rights movement, the bits of it that I've seen and taken part in, tries to be inclusive. I think about, Trans Pride, where we have trans people with disabilities and trans people of colour speak and trans people from other countries come and speak. I hope there is possibility for coalition building. I don't think there is going to be a way to succeed that doesn't involve that. I think sometimes that scarce resource mindset does creep in. I know within the trans community, that's a problem. Is that sometimes if someone does do well, then others are starting to go, wow, sod them, they don't count anymore. I think that's part of
Tall poppy syndrome.
I think that's part of it, and I don't think there can be too much love and too much solidarity.
I think that seems like a really nice place to end up. There can not be too much love or too much solidarity. Abigail Thorn, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.